Hi, Jamelle. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. So, introductions here. I am Peter Suderman, an associate editor at Reason Magazine.
And I am Jamelle Bouie, a writing fellow at The American Prospect.
So today, I guess we're going to talk about, we're going to engage in some sort of baseless 2012 speculation here, talk a little bit about Obama's prospects, the GOP field. So I'm just sort of curious here. Things really don't look so great for Obama on a lot of fronts. I mean, if you sort of take the conventional political science wisdom that the economy is the best predictor of whether or not a president is going to get reelected, things really don't look good for him. On the other hand, it also, to me, doesn't look like the GOP has a terribly strong field here. So I'm sort of curious what your sense of how this is all going to play out looks like right now.
So I basically fall in line with the political science wisdom, though I think I might differ a little bit. I'm not quite sure that the economy, like a poor economy, is not good for president's reelection prospects, but I think it's more accurate to say that things like growth in disposable income are the best predictor of what happens. As far as the share of the two-party vote is concerned, and that by measures like that, Obama isn't doing terribly well. That said, I'm not yet convinced that Obama's doomed to failure or toast, like my colleague Adam Serwer would say, if only because Obama still manages to be more popular than just about any other politician, national level politician in the country. Americans may not like the direction the country's going in, but in other surveys tend to say that they think Obama has the interest of the United States at heart. Voters don't really like the GOP candidates very much. Even in states where Obama is pretty unpopular, or at least below 45%, the GOP candidates are doing even worse. We're sort of in this place where Obama clearly is at risk for losing his reelection campaign, but it's sort of not necessarily because the GOP is providing some sort of compelling alternative, but because conditions are just leading people to evaluate his presidency poorly. But if conditions were to improve, I think even slightly or even moderately, I think Obama wins re-election.
Sort of two quick points to that. It's not just, I think, voters who don't really like the GOP presidential candidates. It's in fact a lot of Republicans, professional Republicans and conservatives, who don't really care for the current field. There was this big story in Politico this week about sort of how GOP elites were sort of pinning their hopes on Mitch Daniels, and now of course he dropped out, and then they sort of switched to pinning their hopes on the possibility of a Chris Christie run or a Paul Ryan run, and it really looks unclear that either of them are going to run. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I think GOP leads should feel a little better. I mean, around this time in 1992, Democrats had similar worries about their field. None of the heavy hitters had really entered the field. You had just a bunch of obscure senators, congresspeople, and some random governors from states known for early visits. And one of those random governors from the state known for early visits ended up winning the nomination and beating George H.W. Bush. So, I sort of understand elite anxieties about the field, but I do think that if conditions are so bad that Obama is going to lose re-election, then the GOP has to nominate someone exceptionally unqualified, untalented to lose that election.
I do wonder if it's a little bit of a sliding scale, though. To some extent, Obama is running against the economy, running against the unemployment rate. But at a certain point, he's going to have a little more leeway. It's going to be a higher unemployment rate that will take to knock him out if the GOP candidate is sufficiently unappealing, right? I mean, a particularly at 11% unemployment or whatever, if things totally collapse, he's almost certainly out, even if it's Michelle Bachmann, even if it's Sarah Palin write-in. Campaign.
Absolutely.
But then sort of at more plausible numbers, If there's sort of a sliding scale there, and some candidates are going to have an easier time beating him, I think. But you said you said initially that that you think he's got a good chance if things get better. But I wonder, how likely is it that the economy, that the significant economic predictors are going to get better here, especially given that, as far as I understand it, voter perception tends to lag behind.
Right.
It tends to lag. So what you really want is sort of what he really needs is movement sometime between now and about May or June of next year. And even if it's just a little bit positive movement, that would probably help him a lot. But it looks quite possible that, in fact, movement will be bad, perhaps even very bad, between now and next summer.
Right. I mean, I think, a little better for me just means that things don't get significantly worse. If the economy doesn't, fall into a second recession, then Obama will be doing pretty well. But you're right. No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask, do you think that a lot of this, when we talk about the political science here, it's all sort of based on the economy. Do you think that a lot of this is kind of out of Obama's hands at this point? He's announcing his jobs. He's got this job speech that's lined up for September, the jobs plan, or whatever you want to call it. And at first it was a very, very specific plan. Now it's more of a framework. And Axelrod's saying, well, maybe some of the ideas won't be brand new ideas. So it's sort of, he's basically announcing that they're going to rehash some old ideas in a, sort of a broad outline of things they'd like to do. But even if you think those things are likely to work, like if they passed, the Republican House isn't going to let them through. They're not going to work even if they're good policy because Republican opposition. Right.
No, you're right. It's, for the most part, the main determinant of his political fortunes is out of his hands. For the time to focus on that stuff was really until fall of 2009, when it became clear how bad the recession was, or a little more clear about the recession was, and there was still the possibility for maybe a little more stimulus. I'm still skeptical as to the extent to which Democrats could have gotten anything further in without compromising other goals. But if you hold to the view that there is still an opportunity to do more for the economy then that would have been the time to do it. From that. Yeah?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I do want to hear where you're going here. I just have a question about that.
I was going to say, from now until really the election, the only thing Obama can do is sort of make contrast and sort of count on both the GOP nominee, that even if that nominee isn't sort of objectively weak, is weakened by the process of becoming the nominee, either through a protracted primary or through sort of like if Mitt Romney gets nomination, for instance, he'll have to say a lot of right-wing and potentially unpalatable things through the primaries, which can easily be used against them once the general election hits. So sort of relying on that, and then also trying to tie any GOP nominee to congressional Republicans who are just incredibly unpopular with the public. Essentially saying to voters that you may not like conditions in the economy, you may not even like me that much, but this is the alternative, and do you really want that?
So, you say the time to act would have been fall 2009, would have been, earlier, and doesn't that at least give a little bit of credence to the GOP line that the Democrats should have been focusing on jobs, on the economy, rather than spending the first year of his presidency passing the healthcare overhaul? Doesn't that suggest that at minimum there was a political cost? Maybe you weigh it and you think, okay, the policy cost was worth it. We got health insurance for 30 million people. But doesn't that suggest that at least that in some ways the Republicans were right, that there was a political cost to spending all of that energy, all of that time working on a healthcare bill that now is not, is not giving anybody jobs, is not, improving the economy substantially around the election time?
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. In fact, that I think the decision to go with healthcare reform was the right one. If that is sort of like a party priority, given the extent to which that was a huge party priority, it was either then or wait another 20 years before the opportunity popped up again. So I'm not. I think in policy terms, Democrats were right to go that route, but politically they did cost themselves by not sort of going back to the well when they had the chance. So I'm not entirely convinced that the Democrats could have gotten substantially more. Like there would have never been sort of a second $800 billion stimulus bill. There may not have even been like a 400, like half that amount. I sort of you can't prove this. It's sort of just a speculation, just intuition on my part. But I think that part of getting healthcare reform passed required liberal Democrats and even some moderate Democrats to just sort of acquiesce on a whole bunch of fronts to the demands of centrist conservative Democrats and things we may have not seen. We certainly saw the big things like the public option or whatnot, but I have a hunch that, let's say, if in October of 2009 Obama had come out loudly for more stimulus, then he might have lost a vote for healthcare reform that he might have otherwise had. And so at that point, with the administration so in deep with healthcare reform, that I don't think it's quite accurate. And again, there's no way of really knowing this, but I have a hunch that it's not quite accurate to say that it's like the Obama administration, ignored any other further stimulus or disregarded the option, but simply weighed sort of their priorities and said, we want to get healthcare reform passed, and we don't want to alienate the people who could block healthcare reform. So let's be a little less ambitious in other areas as we're trying to get this through.
I mean, the political cost in some ways actually goes further than just the opportunity cost of missing the chance to do something else. The healthcare law, obviously you and I have very differing opinions on its merits, but the healthcare law has proven to be at least far less popular than I think a lot of Democratic politicians expected when they voted for it.
I totally. And
so, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the 2010, the 2010 elections were the result of a lot of things, but it's hard to argue that the unpopularity of healthcare reform didn't play into the magnitude of the Democratic loss that year.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, the healthcare law here is sort of Democrats, many Democrats, perhaps even President Obama, may have, it may turn out that they sacrificed their political careers to get it passed. I mean, that may be the situation we end up with. Obviously, it's more than a year out from the election, and Obama could still easily win. I don't think that it's by any means a done deal, and we don't know what the economy is going to look like next summer. We'll know at the time. When it happens, but yeah, it's interesting to me that at this point we're in a situation in which there's not. Pretty much everyone agrees that there is not a whole lot of action that can be taken, certainly at the presidential level. That is, there are things that sort of people say could be done, in theory, but plausibly. The reality is there's not a lot that's going to get done. And so you're in what is, the die is cast in many ways, and you're essentially in a rhetorical fight, that is going to argue, that is going to be about whether or not people think, it's basically going to be a referendum on Obama's presidency. I don't see, much alternative for the way things play out here, and so it's just going to be and although in some ways that actually puts at least the rhetorical from a rhetorical perspective that I think that may put Obama on better footing. He's actually a pretty skilled orator, as we know. I mean, this is in fact the thing that people loved him for, and that he was so good at was painting sort of a picture of how things could or should be. And I don't know that any plausible Republican nominee is going to have going to have that skill that, is going to be able to do something as good. I mean, the of the two most likely nominees, Romney and Perry, Romney always comes off like he's giving a PowerPoint presentation, even when he's not. And Perry appeals to a certain sort of, conservative, but I'm not sure he's going to have the appeal to a lot of Midwestern Republicans, sort of somewhat more moderate Republicans, people who are not as enthused about the Tea Party as sort of the base is. And Obama's actually, for whatever else he's not as good at, he's actually really good at rhetorically appealing to a very large number of people, and that's I think why his favorables are still up. That's why he was able to win last time. And so it may end up being that it may end up that for all else that's going wrong for Obama, the 2012 election puts him on turf where he can win, which is fighting a battle of words.
Part of me thinks that I'm not one of those people who falls into the Obama's playing this 11-dimensional game of chess idea, but part of me thinks that, as of a couple months ago, maybe as of March after the budget battle, or February, March after the budget battle, I would not be shocked if the Obama team says to themselves, this is pretty clear evidence that we're not really going to get any more from this Congress for the rest of the year. So let's try to set up situations where we appear to be the better man, so to speak, the ones willing to compromise and, get stuff done and work hard and all through the lines Obama uses. And I wouldn't be shocked. I'm sort of on record as saying that something like the debt ceiling deal, or debt ceiling situation, was bound to happen this year, given sort of the internal pressures within the GOP caucus in the House. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Obama team made a decision to let the debt ceiling deal be it, sort of agree to the premise that we should negotiate with the debt ceiling for a political purpose, to portray the administration as working in the interest of the public when the GOP is not.
This also sort of suggests, this cuts against. I mean, if this theory is right that it's all about rhetorical turf, and if your sort of idea about the debt ceiling and the fact that it was a political decision to be where they wanted to be seen as negotiators, this also sort of cuts against a lot of the progressive commentary that I've seen recently, arguing that what Obama needs to do is take a really hard line and come out for sort of big bold policies and be more aggressively liberal, at least in his rhetoric, if not, in his policies, given sort of the limits of policy at this point. I mean, and that's going to be a really tough thing for the White House to figure out, to sort of decide is, okay, do we run hard against a GOP that, frankly, is not very popular, or do we run as uniters, hoping, sort of as compromisers, trying to be seen above the fray of Congress in general, which is also just not very popular.
Right. I'm really sympathetic to the view that Obama should just, grab a bat and go against the Republicans with really harsh rhetoric. But I think one of the things I don't think progressives quite realize is that they aren't actually a majority in the Democratic Party, and there's certainly not even like a large plurality in the American public, that progressives and liberals account for about 20% of the public at large and a little over a quarter of the Democratic Party. And that it's entirely possible, we don't really know, but it's possible that, far from bolstering the public's view of an Obama who simply took the bat to Republicans would look partisan in a way that alienated both the general public and people within the Democratic Party who may not like Republicans but don't necessarily consider themselves, ideological liberals in the same way that, liberal bloggers do.
Yeah, although I have to say I think it's harder for progressives to shoot themselves in the foot by convincing themselves that they're a majority or a majority of Democrats than it is for, say, Tea Party types to do the same, because Tea Party types are not a majority, certainly of the public, and it's questionable sort of how how much of the actual of how much of Republicans are truly strong Tea Party types, but they do exert a strong, at least a strong influence on the Republican Party, and so they can swing the Republican Party much further to the right, much easier, I think, than progressives can swing the Democratic Party to the left, and can pull the Republican Party, out of the mainstream, out of sort of that center-left, center-right spectrum, a little faster and a little harder than progressives can. So, in some ways, progressives, it may not be to their liking to be not in the majority, but it may, in fact, be to the benefit of their party.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of, I feel like this is getting a little off topic, but I think progressives recognize how important it is to actually have a liberal Congress in terms of furthering their goals. I think that one of the choices that progressive movement, as it were, will have to make is whether they want a big tent Democratic Party that can win large majorities on a fairly regular basis, but be constrained by sort of like the mix of interest once they're in power, or do they want a Democratic Party that is smaller and more liberal, but has fewer opportunities for actually governing? It's sort of you have to have one or the other. You can't have both. And I think this might be something liberals are beginning to come to.
Yeah. So we talked sort of about Obama here a whole bunch, and we've touched a little bit on the GOP field, but this is sort of the other big question, sort of big story that we'll have to watch, over the next year and a half or so, is who ends up as the Republican nominee, and how the Republican Party picks their candidate, how that ends up happening. I mean, you almost have a situation that's kind of like the one that we had in 2008, in which there was no Republican nominee, candidate who could plausibly win the nomination. There was none of them could win. It just could, all of them had definitive strikes, marks against them. On the other hand, one of them had to, and we're kind of in a similar situation here. I think Perry probably has the fewest ticks against him, the fewest marks, but he's the conservative, sort of opinion leaders and conservative policy people are at the very least not terribly comfortable with him. They may sort of ultimately settle for him. And his record, my colleague Shikadalmia wrote a piece looking at his record, and it's like, from a libertarian's perspective, he's done okay. The state has actually done pretty well creating jobs. Staying loose with education. But as a budgeter, Perry has not been, terribly swift. A lot of budget gimmicks going on there. The balanced budget was balanced by that he's touting. It was balanced, using $6 billion in stimulus funds that he was complaining about while he took them. It was also, he's been an aggressive scavenger of federal grants. He's increased spending year over year throughout. It's gone up by about 4% every 2 years, while he's been governor. So he's not. And then the other thing that Ross Douthat pointed out, I think very smartly, was that all of the things that are good about Texas's economy were things, from a conservative or libertarian perspective or whatever, things that arguably made it relatively successful, were things that were there when Perry took office. So it wasn't as if Perry, really can take credit for not, screwing it up after the fact, but he can't really take credit for changing things to make it work better.
Perry can't take credit for the fact that, Texas shares a border with Mexico and lets people immigrate.
Right. But just sort of, this is, we're in this interesting situation again, in which none of these guys, none of the candidates, really seem like plausible contenders. A lot of and the uniters, sort of the people who might appeal to diverse, larger groups. Certainly the people who might bring in the Beltway professionals have stepped out of the race. I was all prepared, to really like Mitch Daniels, and then he kind of disappointed me, deciding to step out. I understand why he did it, but it's I'm curious, sort of, to what's your take on this? I mean, are GOP elites asking for too much? Is there, are any of these candidates actually pretty good candidates? Is this just sort of, is this what we've, I don't know here, is this the result of the Tea Party, sort of, sort of, this is what you get when that's the base?
Right. I think it's a mix of all of these things, right? Like, in a party where the Tea Party was not as influential, I think Mitt Romney would be the obvious nominee. It's been what, 5 years since he was governor of Massachusetts, and he's more or less, he may have been a huge flip-flopper or what have you back in 2007, but by this point he's been almost for half a decade like sort of on the same basic pitch of Orthodox Republican. So I think, you can imagine a different Republican Party where everyone would just sort of like, okay, whatever, Mitt Romney has sufficiently proven his bona fides as a conservative, and, the guy is a very plausible contender against President Obama. He, alone among the GOP nominees, polls best against Obama. And I think, he'd just be the natural choice. Because of the
are his poll numbers just name recognition, though?
Poll numbers are, at this point, poll numbers are kind of just partly name recognition, partly sort of like an expression of disapproval of Obama. And Mitt Romney probably is the most recognizable of the GOP nominees. I think Rick Perry on paper seems like he should be ideal, right? He can at least claim some of Romney's advantages of being a governor, successfully presiding over a state, but lacks sort of Romney's ideological vulnerabilities, namely that like no one doubts Perry's fidelity to the conservative base, or at least like conservative ideas. But since he entered the race, Perry has just been, every week it seems or every day it seems like Perry has said something that makes him unpalatable to large numbers of Americans. He just
isn't that his style though? Isn't that sort of, there's this sort of competing there are these competing narratives about Perry. One is that he is an extremist, and he's also kind of adult. Sort of all hair, no brains. And you've got, Bruce Bartlett calling him an idiot and that sort of thing. And then there's this other narrative, that's been put forth by folks like the economists Erica Greider,
right,
who've argued that, in fact, he's really a fairly savvy political operator. And, maybe he's not, the swiftest policy mind in the world. But when it comes to designing policies that will please the conservative base for the most part, and when it comes certainly to sort of managing his image, he's done relatively well. And the other thing that I looked at in the column I wrote last week was that if you can look at Perry's rhetoric about this stuff and sort of take away the perception that he's a super extreme federalist. But then if you actually, you can look at his rhetoric. But if you look at his record, you compare his rhetoric to his record is a lot more moderate, at least in comparison. And it looks to me a lot like he's someone who enjoys and has gotten political benefit from saying a lot of stuff that will get him noticed, get him attention, and sort of get him the conservative street cred, the Texas, here's somebody who's really about independence, who's really about sticking it to the federal government. But then when it comes down to it, he's also more than happy to take and go after any federal money he could get.
Right. Let me just to go back to your the comment about Perry being sort of a savvy operator. I think it's completely correct. I think Democrats or liberals or whatever are they're not being smart by tackling Perry as some sort of dumb extremist. My general position is that anyone who has become governor of one of the largest states in the country and has kept the position for a decade is probably not a dumb person. probably you may disagree with him. You might think he is doing terrible things for a state, but underestimating the sophistication of a person like that doesn't strike me as a particularly good idea. And so if Perry is nominee, I just hope Democrats don't, take the approach of, well, he's just, another dumb cowboy. That's not going to play well in a general election, I don't think at all. But as to sort of the question that Perry's rhetorical extremism versus his record, I think you're right. I mean, I wouldn't, I would call.
I'm
Perry
not saying his record isn't conservative. I'm not saying he's some sort of liberal or a total squish moderate kind of type. I'm just suggesting that it's not that he doesn't always follow through on these sort of big swaggery promises that he that he makes. Threatening to drop out of Medicaid, all that sort of thing.
That sounds about right.
And in fact, I mean, to me, that almost seems like a perfect fit for better or for worse, for the Republican moment right now, where you have this sort of great Tea Party, irritation with Washington, with Democrats, with President Obama, with, sort of the role of the federal government. But when you actually get down to the specifics of what they really want done, a lot of the time, they want a lot of nibbling around the edges, and they want a lot of sort of, rhetorical firepower, but not nearly as much sort of actual government cutting. And so this is always very frustrating for the libertarian crowd, where we see this sort of we see this small government energy, but then when you actually go in and look at what sort of look at opinions about entitlements, about spending. It seems like everybody wants to cut foreign aid, and they want to fix the budget problem by cutting foreign aid, which is, and like, okay, but what else? And so I sort of suspect that a President Perry, a Perry campaign, sort of going forward, that is a lot of what we'd end up with, is somebody who's sort of a fire breather in one sense, but handled policy in a much more sort of politically calculated kind of way, and did not actually take the big extreme steps that a lot of liberals, it seems to me, are worried that he might go after. So I don't know. Maybe my message here is that, hey, Tea Party, the Rick Perry is probably right for you, and hey, liberals, he's not. He's not quite as scary as you think.
Right. I mean, obviously, for liberals, a Perry presidency, because no likelihood a Perry presidency would also come.
Right. Not ideal.
It would come with probably a Republican Senate. I would, I think best case scenario for Democrats next year is Obama wins the presidency, and the House either the margin narrows considerably, or it outright flips with a slight Democratic majority. Perry presidency, I think, might result in that not happening, and so Republicans would at least have nominal control over the House and the Senate. And so I agree that you wouldn't see, and I get into this argument with folks in the office all the time, I agree that you wouldn't see large scale cuts to every cherished liberal program, but it wouldn't be, we'd be pretty unhappy.
Right. I again don't want to suggest that he is some sort of center left moderate in who has disguised himself with an R after his name. So speaking of cuts here, do you have any interest in talking about the super committee?
Yes.
And how that's going to go?
And how it's not going to go? Yeah.
So I wrote a post suggesting that at least from a libertarian perspective, the trigger cuts might be the best alternative here, the best plausible alternative anyway, and that the triggers, sort of cuts, large-scale cuts to defense, as well as cuts, some small provider cuts to Medicare and other types of spending, if they could actually go through, and if Congress would actually follow through on them, and rather than unpulling the trigger, as Josh Barrow of the Manhattan Institute said, it very well could. That this might be, sort of the best we're likely to get. I'm sort of curious, what are you sort of hoping for? What's your sort of best possible outcome from the deficit from the super committee here?
I think we're actually probably on the same page with this. I think the best, given how I don't trust that, say, if the super committee were to come to an agreement on tax reform, if the super committee were to come to agreement about, well, let me go back. Since I don't think that tax increases at all would come out of the super committee, since I don't think a super committee solution on the tax reform would be necessarily optimal. It seems to me that the best outcome is for gridlock and for the trigger to be pulled. That's a really awkward way of saying that. And the cuts to defense, the cuts to the provider cuts to Medicare, the various other cuts. I was talking to Jared Bernstein not too long ago, and he mentioned that if the trigger's pulled and if the cuts in the debt deal go through, and if those tax cuts are reversed or allowed to expire in full, then we've essentially solved the medium-term debt problem.
That gets you, so if the trigger is pulled, it's 1.2, 1.5 trillion or so. And,
right. It's like 1.2 trillion, and then the interest savings bring it up to 1.5, I think.
Yeah, it's right. So it's $1.5 trillion, a little less, and then allowing the Bush tax cuts to expire at least gets you something like 2.5, a little 2.2, 2.5 in scored deficit reduction over the next decade. So that sort of gets you your 1 decade reprieve.
Right.
Maybe that's your 4 trillion roughly. But it doesn't do anything about the long-term issues. And a decade reprieve is enough time to perhaps, sort of craft a better solution. But it doesn't actually take the long-term issues off the table. And so
right, no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
No, yeah, you're right, it doesn't. But I'm just saying that if the goal is sort of medium-term deficit reduction, debt stabilization, then, the triggers plus removing the Bush tax cuts gets you there.
Although then you have to still follow through on this. And this is the wisdom on this from old Washington budget hands is pretty clear, left, right, libertarian, which is that even if you get these, that these committees and the triggers and sequestration, sort of the across the board cuts, it doesn't really pay off in the long term. What was it? Stan Collender, I've got a quote here. If budget history is any guide, the overwhelming likelihood is that the deal will have no impact whatsoever and will be abandoned long before it is implemented. So, regardless of whether there is a deal to make cuts or whether there's no deal and we go with the cuts that happen with the no deal cuts, with the trigger cuts, it seems highly likely, at least, that you end up with nothing happening here. Which doesn't solve any problem. And so I guess I'm sort of, I don't know. I am relatively morose about the prospects for solving the even the medium term budget problems. Figuring out how to do this at all. Even if tax hikes. Whether or not you like them, they're not going to happen. The Republicans are not going to. We saw the 10-1 deal offered at the debate the other night, and every Republican raised his hand. No, would not take a $10 in cuts for $1 in tax hikes deal.
Right. Sort of the problem though is that any conceivable legislation can always be. You can't force a future Congress to do anything. That's sort of the problem.
Right.
That regardless of any deal, of any sort of like long-term policy, if a future Congress wants to change it, they can. And so at a certain point, anything that happens, you sort of have to take on the faith or the hope that future Congresses will consider it binding. It's sort of like one of those problems you just can't get around. And I think, the goal for people who are very much interested in reducing the medium-term debt, for my part, I just don't think that debt reduction ought to be the priority of the federal government at the moment. But if you are one of those people who think it should be, then the next step needs to be lobbying for and trying to elect people who will hold to those previous deals, making sort of like, will you continue to cut this spending? A litmus test for future politicians.
So let me see if I can sort of put all this together here. It seems to me like, Republicans on the one hand say they want to deal with the debt problem, run against the deficit pretty strongly. You actually have a lot of Democrats who argue that while job creation, sort of economic stimulus should be the goal right now, that the debt that sort of in the medium and certainly in the long term, debt and deficit issues should be resolved, and that in fact there's the best policy is one that offers sort of an upfront, sort of very near-term stimulus paired with medium-term deficit reduction.
Right.
And so, and that they would like, and the sort of obviously the liberal consensus is that they would like to see at minimum tax rates raised on top earners, and some folks go further and would like to see some middle class tax hikes, as part of that as well. But at minimum, tax rates raised on top earners. So to me, what I kind of wonder here is, why don't Republicans take that and drive a really hard bargain? Ask Democrats. I feel like you could get Democrats in Congress to agree to perhaps really serious reforms to entitlements. And to spending, to spending overall, but certainly to entitlements, which is where the long-term debt problem really lies, and take some tax hikes with that. If the Republicans would take the tax hikes with that now, here's the thing: entitlement changes are really hard to make, but it's really easy to lower tax rates, right?
Right.
And in fact, Republicans, if they wanted to just from a sort of a strategic perspective, if Republicans wanted to sort of take a we'll raise some taxes now kind of deal and then run for the next 10 years on lowering taxes, it would be relatively easy to get those tax rates reduced back to wherever they are now, perhaps even lower. Because lowering taxes is something that almost nobody, not almost nobody, but certainly that you can get moderate Democrats on board with, that the public loves, and that every Republican will always go for. And so it strikes me that there's like a sort of a half devious plan to go back on their word here, that Republicans could take. And I mean, and this is, maybe it's not the best sort of policy, but if Republicans want to do entitlement reform, want to do long-term debt reduction, there's a path forward to doing it, and then they can work on some of those sort of shorter-term, sort of easier to manipulate policy issues like tax rates after the fact. And I guess it's sort of funny to me that no one's even talking about doing anything like that.
Right. No, and you're right. I mean, if I were a congressional Democrat, or like if I were the Democratic Party in that scenario, then sort of the pushback, Republicans would pursue that, but the obvious pushback is for Democrats to say, well, how about instead of you raising, marginal income taxes, we sort of revamp the tax code, and let's say we implement a carbon tax as part of this deal, as part of sort of like more a better source of revenue over the next decade or so. How about we try to, implement tax reform that would close lots of loopholes and lower rates and all those sorts of things. So to counter that offer with the sort of taxes that aren't as easy to cut, right? And we'll force Republicans to sacrifice a bit more, right? Like a carbon tax, in addition to probably being a little harder to cut over the long term, would also force Republicans to acquiesce on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with that route is Republicans just are so I think incorrect. Obviously, I think incorrectly, but Republicans are so dead set against sort of even admitting that there's that policy that that global warming is something that that human beings contribute to, and that there's policy that there's any policy that you can put in place to do something to mitigate it, to do something about it. I think that it's an open question to me whether Republicans are more dead set against tax hikes or more dead set against admitting that global warming is partially caused by human activity. In the end, I think that you could probably it strikes me that Republicans have more leeway, more give on tax rates than they do on global warming, because the base at least sort of accepts the premise that taxes have to exist, right? There are very few people who are like, we shouldn't have taxes, period. And many Republican voters are at least open to the idea, maybe they don't love it, but at least open to the idea of taxing wealthy people more, regardless of, let's forget the policy merits for a little while, but there are polls that show that at least large numbers of the Republican base are open to that idea, but there's not a lot of Republican voters who really seem to think that climate change is something that human activity plays any role in. It's not settled science, right? I mean, Chris Christie is getting a lot of crap for this right now. I think my colleague Ron Bailey has written about this, and it's not even like Chris Christie's doing. Christie is rejecting policies that he doesn't think will actually sort of environmental policies that are theoretically designed to fight global warming, but that he doesn't think are actually going to have a strong effect. But he's doing so while recognizing that there is a human role, and he's taking a huge amount of crap from the Republican base for this. And there's just not many Republican leaders who are willing to step up and say that, and the ones that do tend to be sort of marginal candidates.
Like John Huntsman, for example. Right.
So I mean, we have seen what the Huntsman line on the debt deal, on global warming, on that the whole sort of package of issues, what it has done to him. It has made him a media darling in some ways, more media attention than his poll numbers deserve, and a lot less Republican enthusiasm. It has cost him a lot of Republican enthusiasm.
Right. So do you want to move to something a little less dry than policy?
Sure. We talked about the super committee. We can talk about the other super committee, the Avengers.
Right, the Avengers.
The Avengers movie, which is coming out next summer.
And I look at so many set photos that I always forget that it's going to be a year before this movie even comes out. But I'm excited for it nonetheless. I really enjoyed Captain America. I like Thor. I seem to be the only person who holds that opinion. And, of course, the Iron Man films are pretty good. So, I think Marvel has a good track record so far, and, I expect the Avengers to at least be a fun summer popcorn film.
So I liked Thor when I first saw it. I was more disappointed by it the more I thought about it. But I think I wrote a 3-star review of it at the time. I had a similar-ish opinion with Captain America, which is that I quite liked it sort of while I was watching it, but the more I thought about it, the less I liked it. Not to say that I really hated it, and Captain America I think stands up better than Thor. But the thing that bothered me most about Thor, and this is what worries me about the Avengers, is that the Avengers is being directed and is written by Joss Whedon, the guy who behind behind Firefly, the movie Serenity, behind Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I love Joss Whedon, and I think he's perfect for the job. He did a 2-year run on X-Men a couple of years back that was just phenomenal. He really understands the Marvel universe, the Marvel way of things. He's a great writer and a really sharp director. But with Thor, Thor was directed by Kenneth Branagh, and it didn't feel even a little bit like a Kenneth Branagh film. It felt like a Marvel corporate property, sort of a production of the Marvel machine. And so I am worried that is the precedent sort of that they're setting, that the Marvel machine, while it has a track record of producing very competent films, they've not put out any from at least out of the Marvel studios that are just total trash. But it's pretty clear that they didn't let Branagh be Branagh in a Thor movie, which is sort of the best place for a guy like Branagh to make his mark on the Marvel Universe. And so I'm a little worried that Whedon is going to have the film sort of directed for him from above, and that he will get to sort of insert little Whedonisms here and there, slightly more clever dialogue, maybe a sort of slightly tighter script, but that for the most part, Marvel will be running the show rather than Whedon, and that's what worries me.
I think it might depend on how much trust Marvel has in Whedon, right? Like, I think if Marvel obviously, they've invested a ton of money into this Avengers project, so they needed to succeed. And I think that if Marvel feels that Whedon is the absolute best person who can make this succeed, then they might step away a little bit and let him take control. By contrast with sort of the other films, it's almost like a Ponzi scheme, right? Like you buy your admission to these films in the hopes that the final one will be good. And because for Thor, especially, the momentum has already been built up. I think you can afford to be a little less concerned with the quality of the film, frankly. These people are going to see it, and they're going to see it in anticipation of the Avengers. So, I don't know. It seems like a factor of... Oh, go ahead.
I guess I was just going to say that I'm worried that Marvel has taken a strong sort of anti-autorist stance here.
Yeah.
Because if you go back and look at what they did with their first string of big budget movies, they had Bryan Singer directing X-Men, and it was a very Bryan Singer-esque film, right? It felt like X-Men, but it was clear that Bryan Singer was the one behind both of those first two films. Same with the Spider-Man films. Sam Raimi. These were Sam Raimi movies. Yes, they were a little bit, the rough edges had been sanded off. Sort of the really weird parts of what Sam Raimi wants to do. But it's very much following through on his sort of long-standing themes, a lot of his sort of directorial style. There's a great sequence in Spider-Man 2 that you actually see it's shot from the perspective of Doc Ock's claws, right? And that strategy worked until you got to the Ang Lee Hulk, which was a disaster. And it seems to me like after that, they really pulled back, started putting and you got Jon Favreau directing Iron Man, and he did a great job with the two films that he's done, but they don't feel like products of a singular voice. They feel like products of just of the Marvel corporate machine, which is okay, but they're less. But as a result, sort of you maintain a more consistent quality control, but you're much less likely to get something that's really spectacular.
Maybe the Avengers will be competing next year with The Dark Knight Rises, and maybe sort of that fact might enter into Marvel's calculations with regards to how much control they allow Joss Whedon. Because say what you will about the Nolan films, they are very clearly, they're the Nolan films. They're very clearly the work of Christopher Nolan and his sort of vision for his films and for Batman.
Yeah, the DC clearly picked the Batman strategy of letting a guy like Nolan, a sort of smallish film, a director of smallish films with a track record of having a strong, interesting vision, based on the success of the early Marvel films. And I was kind of surprised to see that they didn't take that route with Green Lantern this summer, which was really kind of disappointing. And that
that movie was terrible.
I don't think it was as bad as everybody thinks. It was at the very low end of sort of summer blockbuster competence. It was a sort of 2-star. Very very sort of just. I don't know if you it was a total 2-star movie is the best way I could put it. Like, it didn't do anything really terribly wrong. It also did absolutely nothing right. And so but DC took that strategy clearly of, okay, let's get somebody that we can manage to run this project, and then DC managed it and didn't let somebody with a strong vision take hold. And I guess it's hard to criticize these companies for what they're doing. These are these huge projects, and you can't it's obviously big risks, big financial risks are involved, and so turning over a $150 million project to somebody with a weird vision that might not strike the right notes with the public is a big risk. But it also seems like they stand to gain a lot more. I mean, look at the best superhero films, not just critically but financially, have all been sort of the products of individuals with strong
right.
visions.
And
so I'm hoping that that's what they can do with Avengers.
Right, and DC is going that route again with Superman. I mean, I have a feeling that Superman will be a very Zack Snyder film. Like,
for better or for worse, yes.
Yeah, for better or for worse, but you don't choose a guy like Zack Snyder because you want a lot of control of the final product.
Right. And they're letting they've got Nolan producing, and Nolan was heavily involved in sort of setting the tone, picking the director, figuring out what direction they wanted to go. And
right.
I think that actually makes a lot of sense. They've got somebody who clearly loves their properties, loves their characters, and letting him and giving him sort of the top job of overseeing the whole product line makes hopefully will pay off when we see Superman in Christmas of 2012, something like that. We have the pre-election, or maybe it's been delayed till 2013. So that's right. Yeah. So anyway, I very much hope that Whedon. I think the best hope we have for Whedon is not so much that they look back on the old strategy and think let's try to replicate that, but just that Whedon is part of the Marvel family in a lot of ways. They gave him the X-Men books, and he's clearly friendly with not just with the Hollywood people, but with the people on the comic book side, the people who just run the publishing business, and gets along with those guys, and they know him and trust him well enough that perhaps they'll let him do what he wants here, which I think is going to be best for all of us.
Right.
Well, I don't know if you want to talk about anything else here, or if you're ready to finish up. But anything else we want to go through here?
No, I think we're good.
Awesome. Well, very nice talking to you as always, sir.
Likewise.
Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, you too.
Bye, Jamelle.
Right.